Brand to me is how you become top of mind. How do you make sure that you stay top of mind for the folks that are on the platform, whatever your platform is? You cannot market your way out of a really bad product. And so your product has to be really good. But I think in order to really grow your brand and to become a persevering brand, you have to work on some of that.
Welcome to Experimental, the podcast that cuts through the noise to bring you actionable insights in B2C growth, marketing, and data science. I'm your host, Sundar, former head of brand data science at Uber and the mind behind the Experimental newsletter. Join me as I talk with industry leaders who have driven growth at companies like Uber, Spotify, and Netflix. We'll uncover the experiments, failures, and breakthroughs that lead to real results. Now, let's get experimental. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Experimental. I'm joined by Gopal Nath, someone I've worked with in the past for a few years and had an absolute great relationship with. He's an amazing person, but also a fantastic marketing data scientist and leader. I'm excited to have him on here. Gopal, why don't you go ahead and just start by introducing yourself and just a brief background about you and your career.
Yeah, what a nice intro. Like Sundar said, my name is Gopal. I've been in the marketing analytics space for maybe 12 years now, working in a couple of different fields, both in nonprofit, and then I switched over into tech, where I started Uber, which is where Sundar and I started to work together midway through my career there. And then recently I switched over to Faire, leading our marketing analytics team here for both sides of our marketplace.
So one thing I wanted to start off with is you've worked now for two incredible marketplaces, and marketplaces are just an intense business model, but they're also really hard from a marketing aspect because you have to always balance supply and demand. Tell us a little bit about, how do you think about marketing in a marketplace?
Yeah, I think for me, and maybe this is a little bit biased just because of both Faire and Uber's kind of position on growth, but I think when you're growing a marketplace, particularly through marketing, ensuring that you're doing it in the most cost efficient and ROI positive way is probably the number one thing. I'll say, at Uber, we were pretty blessed in that our marketplace was very, very healthy for the most part, particularly on rides. Eats obviously in the beginning was a little bit harder, particularly because it's a three-sided marketplace. But I think when you're making those decisions of how you want to scale your marketplace, you're probably going to lean a little bit towards a little bit less efficiency. And then over time, you're going to become more and more efficient. For me, I think the way that marketing shows up there is to help drive the right customers on the demand side and the right call it drivers, couriers, restaurants, brands, etc., on the supply side of the marketplace in order to drive efficient growth, both from a dollar perspective as well as from a supply and a marketplace balance perspective.
And you've now mentioned efficiency. Tell me a little bit more about what did efficiency look like at Uber and what does efficiency look like at Uber? Like, what is the definition of efficiency for you?
That's a great question. On the marketing side, we had I want to say it was maybe 6-line long definition of efficiency, but really what it comes down to is you're going to set your goals around kind of what you want your CP dollars to be, and how long you're willing to wait in order to get those dollars back. And so efficiency is just going to be based on how much are you spending relative to how much you're planning to get back. And are you making it within the time frame that you want? You're going to have different efficiency levers at different points in your growth, particularly in a marketplace. Earlier on in your growth as a marketplace, efficiency is not going to be something that you're going to be hyper focused on. You're not really worried about what the payback time frame, for instance, is going to be, or what the return on ad spend is going to be right away. You're worried about, I need to keep growing at X% amount year over year and make this marketplace as big and as healthy as I can. And then over time, you're going to get to a point where you're going to be a little bit more conscious of the dollars that you're spending. And then, it's between, I wouldn't say there's any one right number. I think it depends on the marketplace, how healthy you are, your liquidity, and then the growth path that you have between not just paid, but also the other channels that are driving growth, and what your appetite for kind of burn is, basically. I can say that Uber, I think we were looking largely towards a 2-year LTV. And our goal was to be, our return on ad spend goal was varied by continent. And so what we were looking at was basically some kind of ratio, 1 being, break even within a time frame, above 1 being you're making more money than it costs to acquire that incremental rider or eater. And then below, meaning you're losing a little bit of that money. And so really it's not 2-year return that you're going to get. It's maybe 2.5 or 3 years that it's going to take to to make that money back. And so I think that's largely going to be a joint decision, both between marketing, but also in particular, kind of like your strategy and planning, your ops and your finance teams, to understand what the balance is and what you're willing to kind of burn in order to grow.
Interesting one that you brought up is even just that relationship with strategy and planning. Because I know at Faire, you're the director of strategy and analytics, right? So are you a little bit more tied to the strategy and planning team, or is that a separate function? Like, what does that dynamic look like at Faire? And then what did it also look like at Uber?
That's a great question. So the way that we're structured at Faire is my team sits inside of a strategy and analytics team. And so we're organized in pods and pillars. And so our kind of pod, if you will, is on growth. So particularly more focused on retailer growth right now, though we do a little bit on the brand side, just not right now. And so we're really focused on kind of how are we going to drive retailer growth, and in two different places, one being lifecycle, which is a little bit kind of separate from this, and then unpaid. And so the way that we work, it's definitely not just myself or my team making the decisions. We work really, really closely with our F&S team, or our strategic finance team, to help drive these goals, because there's both a kind of bottoms up approach to the planning and our forecasting that we're doing at a channel, sub-channel level, to say, hey, this is what we expect out of these, this is the return that we're going to get, etc. But then there's also kind of the top down from our F&S teams that are telling us, hey, our long-term plan, we want to be able to grow by this percentage year over year, and so in order to do that, certain channels have to grow, and so there's kind of going to be a balance in between where our bottoms up may say, we're going to grow at X percent, top down says we need to grow at Y%. And so we have to figure out how can we kind of bridge the gap there, and how much of that is feasible, how much more spend would we need in order to bridge that gap versus kind of you call it our expected run rate plus our testing spend.
Something I've found with some strategic finance teams is they often don't have the context into marketing, right? So they don't understand, how marketing works, or even just how measurement strategies. How have you found that at the two places you've worked at? How do you overcome that, right? How do you have a good relationship with strategic finance?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I would say both at Uber and at Faire, I think we were particularly blessed in that the organizations are set up in such a way that they understand the value and the incremental lift that marketing, particularly paid marketing, can bring when done right. And so we've been really lucky in that we have kind of a dedicated POC for each of these. So we have a finance and strategy person who is primarily allocated towards paid and within retailer growth, basically, as our pod. And so, we're really lucky in that sense, in that, because there's a dedicated individual, they're able to learn very quickly much more about what goes into the marketing, how do the metrics come in, what can we measure, what can we not measure, how do we need to do it. And so that they're able to kind of build that knowledge base and that muscle really, really quickly. And at Uber, I think it was kind of the same way, right? We had Uber was massive in any way, but we had a huge finance team, but there was a team of F&S folks that were allocated towards marketing, of which there was a subsection, I think it was maybe 3 or 4 people that were allocated specifically towards paid marketing within a global sense. And then we had kind of our continent folks as well. And I think in that model, it works really well because they're basically embedded within marketing. And because of that, they're able to build the knowledge and the skill set. I think it's when you're at a smaller place and you don't have that, it can be a lot harder to communicate and bridge the gap of, hey, why isn't it as easy as turning on 10% more spend it equals 10% more riders or more eaters or more retailers that grow on your platform, and having to explain kind of where you are within the curve and how efficiency changes and why it's not one-to-one. As when you don't have someone who's embedded in that spot, it makes it a lot harder to communicate and build that, and it takes a lot more reps than when you do have someone who's embedded.
But you had joined Uber in 2014. So, right? 2015.
Yeah.
And I joined in 2016, but they didn't have a robust global measurement team at that point, or even right. Yeah. So we started on local operations teams, and it's a little different because also the tooling, the resourcing, and the context of knowledge are not as much there. So kind of what you were talking about, when you're on these local teams, I'm sure there's situations where hey, we're going to distribute 10% more marketing spend or promotion spend or whatever spend. How did you work, with local, whether it was a general manager or a local operations manager, to communicate that? Because it's not the same as working with a seasoned strategic finance person or a strategic marketing leader.
Yeah, I think there was kind of two things that were occurring then. At least in the rapid evolving change of when I started, of being from a city team and then that morphing into like a sub-regional team that covered a handful of states. It took a lot of different iterations. What I would say is that I think from a marketing standpoint, the number one thing that we had to be able to do when we wanted to increase budget was to be able to show what we expected out of that return and how we were going to deploy it. And I think if you're able to do those things, being on that local team, it was a little bit easier to kind of pull the levers there because the team was considerably smaller and you had a GM who was effectively acting as the CEO of a locality, right? Be it a city or a sub-region or a set of states. And so we would generally have to work with, and I know it's like kind of is an interesting situation where we had a global marketing team that was doing a lot of stuff for us, particularly on the paid side. We weren't running our own kind of individual local ads. But when there were changes that came down, it was basically top-down changes that we needed to then understand what the impact could be and then get buy-in. And so there's a little bit of a different versus, what we might do now, which is kind of bottoms up, where we're like, hey, we want to change X amount of spend. This is what we want, what we expect to get in return. Can you guys sign off on it? It's kind of the other way around. And so really the primary thing there was to get an understanding of what was changing, why, what do we think the impact was going to be, and then getting the buy-in from that. And then from a measurement standpoint, where we could, we would always try to do the measurement. Obviously, as you know, with paid marketing, it is not always easy to get measurement. And so you would have to get kind of creative using pre-post, diff and diff, things like that where possible. Obviously not the best ways to do it. But when you're trying to measure at a local level, you're not always going to be able to do something like a geolift test in order to be able to measure. And so you had to kind of get your best methods that you could and have confidence in what you're able to measure and maybe use 2, 3, 4 metrics to try to understand the impact versus just getting a clean geolift test.
Let's double click on that because I imagine a lot of people are going to be in the situation of, listen, I don't have the resources, whether it's sample sizing for A/B testing or whatever it is for geolift. Go through your framework for how do you do measurement in a period, in a place or in a time where you don't have great options.
That is always a fun question because I think it's always an interesting problem when you're working with an analytics or a data science person, because our goal is to try to get the most accurate thing possible. And when you know that that's not going to be the case, you try to have to figure out what you can do in the meantime. And what I'd say is I think using the data that you have at hand and particularly understanding the consumer behavior within the channel that you're trying to measure on, I think is going to be what's most important to understand it. Is a good example of this is recently, we did a test where we were basically identified that our local teams particularly identified that our branded spend in France just wasn't really performing well. I don't speak French, but there's something around the term faire in France, and it was not giving kind of the best results that we would want versus the term faire or searching faire in the US. And it had something to do with the language. I don't remember exactly what it was. Not a linguist. But what we were going to say, where I was going with this was that, we wanted to try to understand, okay, well, if we think the spend is inefficient, is there a world where we could remove this spend but not lose the impact that would have? And so what we ended up doing at that point was basically understanding, okay, well, it's branded search. If you're searching for faire and we don't show up, there's still a significant amount of intent to look for us. And so what we might see is that, if our click to sign up rates were incredibly low because of the term that was showing up and what people might have been searching for, given the language discrepancy there, then you kind of come in and say, okay, well, if we're getting this many signups, I'm going to make up numbers here, but let's pretend that we were getting 10 signups a week. Well, if we turn off branded spend for the term, we would hope then to see our SEO branded signups kind of eat that or cannibalize that 10 signups, right? And so we basically were able to set up kind of a longer tailed kind of pre-post where we were then able to turn off spend on a given week and then monitor to see how much of the estimated brand level signups we were going to get back. And what we were able to identify was that because of the high intent of searching for that term when you were looking for the company, we're actually able to recoup 99% of the signups.
So really it's pre-post, so a methodology that most people would, poo-poo on.
Yep.
But because you're doing it a bit more focused, you're able to get cleaner signal. Is that
Exactly.
what
Yeah.
you'd
It's very focused, one particular channel with a very, very high intent search that we know from the existing spend was not translating to a ton of really efficient signups and conversions for us. And so we were able to set up this test to then say, okay, well, how much are we going to get back if we don't spend this? And we were able to recoup 99% of the signups, which if you can do that and not have the spend, it's kind of an optimal solution. And so, a lot of this also came from an eBay study that was done around branded search and how they went about looking at branded search and their ability to kind of recoup traffic. That was kind of a secondary point for us when we were thinking through the test to say, okay, are there legs here? Has anyone else tried this before? And seeing that other companies, obviously much, much larger, have done this with success and seen the similar behavior kind of gave us enough of a push to say like, okay, we think that there's legs here. We should be able to measure this and see this and have confidence in the output that we can get.
Yeah. And how did you go about starting the test? What was the origin of the test? How did you convince leadership to do it? Because from my point, that's where it always struggles to get past is like, you say you're going to turn on branded search and everyone's like, oh, like, whoa, like, what's that going to do to the business? So yeah, walk us through the process there.
I think we were lucky in the sense of, our local teams were the ones who kind of identified that, there's the terminology differentiation there was causing some inefficiencies. And really what we were able to say was, I think two things. One, we're going to be able to measure this. It might be pre-post, but we are going to be able to measure. It's not like we just turn it off and we don't know what's going to happen. So you can build some confidence around that. We were able to use other studies to kind of help back up that there's legs within this thought here of like turning off branded spend once you get to a certain level could mean that you don't need that anymore because people are specifically searching for you. The last piece I think that's pretty important too is that we can set this up to say, hey, we're going to run, let's say we run this test for 4 weeks or 6 weeks. We can estimate what the total loss of signups is versus the total spend and know that it's a two-way door. And I think that's probably one of the most important things with paid overall is that it is a two-way door. It's not the same as, removing something off the platform that might take months to get back on, like a physical product or something like that. It's more so that, okay, we're going to turn the spend off. There's a risk that we're going to lose a little bit, but it's a two-way door. We can turn it back on. And once, Google, et cetera, kind of recalibrates after a week or two, we'll be back at prior efficiencies, particularly on something like branded search. And so being able to have that confidence and being able to help leadership understand that, it's a two-way door, I think is part of what helps make that sell.
Yeah, that's a really great phrase, two-way door. Most product decisions feel like one-way doors. And I think there's this entrenched thinking of everything is a one-way door. Dig a little deeper on marketing being a two-way door. Like, I don't know if you have more examples you can share about that, or even just how you've been able to frame that, because there's a lot there. That's cool.
Yeah, I will say the two-way door terminology I definitely picked up while I was at Faire, but I think it's a really important one in that it's important to remember what changes are permanent and what changes you can walk back. And I think for a lot of times for marketing, you can flip the switch back to what you were doing before relatively easily. Like you be that through creative or through even on something like Lifecycle where you're experimenting. The treatment doesn't work this year, the cadence of emails or the cadence of SMS or whatever it is doesn't work. You can always turn that off. And then as you revert back to the control, new folks who are getting it will still have the optimized experience that won. And so understanding that some of these changes are not permanent, I think can help make it a lot easier to get testing and to build confidence with leadership, particularly in being able to test things that might seem a little bit riskier, like turning off a branded search, for example.
Maybe a bit of a segue into just branded, right? And its impact on performance, brand versus performance. I'm sure you've been seeing the conversation around like Jaguar and not to get specific into Jaguar, but like walk me through your experience of how does brand impact performance? How have you been able to measure it? How do you think about it? Let's go down that rabbit hole.
From what I remember, of our time at Uber, you were definitely the king of brand measurement there. But yeah, I think for me, I think in tech, there's always this thought that, the product is king. And I think that's definitely true. You cannot market your way out of it. I mean, maybe you can, but it's really hard to market your way of a really bad product. And so your product has to be really good. But I think in order to really grow your brand and to become a persevering brand, you have to work on some of that, the touchy-feely brand marketing type stuff that shows up. And I think, a rebrand like Jaguar is a really interesting one because, on the surface, you kind of see there's like this new text and kind of this like different vibe that they're going for. But, being in marketing, that there was a lot of consumer research studies and things behind the scenes that were helping to push this. So while it might seem funny to some folks who are really entrenched in the old brand, there is a lot of work that went on behind the scenes to help drive the vision of where this new brand went. It wasn't just like one person in a room saying, hey, this is what our typography is going to be. To go back to your original question of how these things kind of go together, brand to me is how you become top of mind. And whether that's you've never heard of that company before, and then you kind of break through for awareness, and then you move down through that top of funnel all the way down through consideration and then conversion. And then secondarily, how do you make sure that you stay top of mind for the folks that are on the platform already, whatever your platform is? And so from like a measurement or perspective, I think, both at Uber and at Faire, we've used, geolift studies to help kind of measure the impact here. And I think we see what a lot of other, companies that are doing marketing, I think really, really well and able to invest in the right set of kind of experimentation tools and things like that. I see is that there is an additive effect. When you have really good brand marketing, you are able to increase the overall bottom line of the business, and be that through new user acquisition, which is what a lot of, I think both at Uber and at Faire, what we're focused on, you can see that, but I think you're also able to see that, and particularly at Uber, I remember seeing this, in that we were able to move existing user behavior as well through branded marketing. And I think that becomes really important. There's this old book called Zero Moment of Truth. And I think basically kind of like the summary for that is like, you want to be like top of mind as soon as someone wants to make a decision about a purchase. And you don't get that only through having a really great product. There has to be kind of reinforcement messaging of what the product does, why it's valuable, how it ties in with your use case, your lifestyle, whatever it is, in order to make sure you win that zero moment of truth, so that you get what we had at Uber, which was kind of like that first look advantage, right? Where we knew, because, and I would say this is arguably both because of the product, but definitely also because of the brand, that users who had both, Uber and a competitor were more likely to open Uber first as an app in order to get from point A to point B. And that doesn't just happen only with a product. There has to be kind of reinforcement messaging through brand in order to drive that.
Yeah, and you saw it work the opposite way with Delete Uber and things like that, where a negative brand perception very clearly takes it away.
Yep.
And it's very hard to build back that trust. And I don't know, I left in 2021. I think you had left soon after, but like, it's not clear whether we've won back those consumers. So yeah, so being top of mind, I love that, the zero moment of truth, right? Just being there. You have to put in the work to be top of mind for that one purchase moment. And so, Faire is a B2B, Uber is a B2C, right? Like is that the best way to characterize them?
I think that's the way that I think for 99% of the people, yeah, that's the way I would look at it. You can make an argument that Uber does also have like a little bit of the B2B vibe on the Eat side, but I think B2C is probably the best way to describe it.
What does that transition from B2C to B2B look like for you? Were there some things that surprised you, things that you found more interesting, less interesting?
So it's really interesting. I will say Faire is definitely B2B. I think by definition, but it's almost like it's like a lowercase b, because our primary kind of target market on the demand side happens to be, more so like, I don't want to say mom and pop only, but not quite so many like multi-location stores. It's not like, Walmart, a retailer that we would expect to have on the platform, right? It's more so like your main street. And so, I probably have a little bit of an easier segue transitioning all the way into B2B because of this. But I think a lot of the characteristics are still the same, right? Like if you look at a B2C company like Uber and you look at a B2B company like Faire, you have two sides of a marketplace, and we'll focus on the ride side on this or eaters. But you're looking for particular product, particular price, and you want to have good experience being able to get that, right? And I think at the end of the day, that part of a marketplace is the same whether you're B2C or you're B2B. The supply side, if you will, you have folks that are looking to make money on that platform, right? And so being able to make sure that the right portion of that supply is being surfaced to the right side of that demand becomes increasingly important as you try to strive to balance your marketplace and make sure that folks are getting the best experience possible. For instance, an interesting kind of like parallel would be on the ride side on Uber. Believe the product still does this because I see this. But what happens when you open up the app? It used to be that you would just have kind of a stack rank of products and it would be static. Now what happens is that they bump the last type of trip that you used. So be it Uber X or Uber Black, whatever it was that you used last tends to be at the top of the menu when you decide to choose kind of what product you want to get a ride on. That to me is like, it's sort of similar to like a recommendation, right? And I think on like the B2B side, particularly in a marketplace where you have retailers and brands who are trying to, retailers who are trying to stock and store their businesses, brands who are trying to get their products out, you're kind of the same thing where, recommendations, helping retailers understand what the best brands might be for them becomes increasingly important, right? So there's a lot of parallels that exist there. It's just kind of the scale at which you operate is very different from like an Uber rider to a retail business.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, really still the same marketing concept, still the same goals, maybe a different, set of lead times, different payback periods, LTV CAC ratios, all the good stuff, but it's fundamentally the same concept. So I want to pivot a little bit to the culture and people. I think we had incredible people at Uber culturally, from like an analytics, experimentation, data drivenness. We were, world class. Yeah, there's other type of culture people can argue about, but that I think to me is neither here nor there for this. You also have now worked at Faire, which to me from the outside seems like has a great culture. I follow Dan Hockenmeyer on LinkedIn. I think you report to him. Talk to me a little bit more about culture and people and how that's been a big part of your career.
Yeah, for sure. I will say, probably early on, I think I was blessed very early on in my career to have really, really great managers. And I learned very quickly that my ability to scale and succeed within a role would be really heavily dependent on both my manager and the people that I work with, right? And I think you're right. At Uber, we had an incredible team, a lot of just unbelievably smart people that had a unique drive and hustle to get things done that it's really hard to replicate in other places, right? And I think there's like something just very special about that time, particularly like the earlier years, 15, 16, 17. That's, it's kind of sometimes can be tough to think back and see like, how can you replicate that, right? By the end of the day, I think the culture that makes a role or a company successful, not a role, but it's just like a team or a company successful, for me at least, comes down to kind of management of ego, and then kind of marrying that with a drive to get things done, and an understanding that, good ideas can come from anywhere. I think if you can get those things together within a team, you're going to be set up for success. Particularly, I think, probably one of the big things I remember, at Uber particularly was, at least in the early days, the number one thing there that I mentioned about, kind of managing of egos, I think was something that was definitely, I think, hard to do. We had some culture values that kind of pointed things the other direction, if you will, a culture of toe stepping that, I think kind of sometimes made it hard for folks to work together because of the friction that could cause. And I think if you're able to kind of get rid of that friction, and it sounds like, relatively cheesy, but like focus on kind of that one team, one dream mentality, I think you're able to get a lot more things done with a lot less friction and a lot less downtime, basically.
Yeah. And are there similar cultural values at Faire that you've really been able to resonate with and you feel like just like really like you're drawn to?
Yeah, I would say, the way that I would, I think kind of define Faire is that Faire is basically, it's kind of like Uber 1.0 hustle with Uber 2.0 culture. And I think for folks in Uber, if you were there during that time, you probably kind of understand how when Dara came in, there was kind of a complete shift of how we operated from a culture perspective. And I think it made things honestly considerably better for everyone. But really, for us, we start with our mission. We're focused on trying to do the right thing for the customer and help the customer succeed. And then for me, I think the core value that resonates the most is that we have one called Seek the Truth. So basically, one of our mantras is basically like dig to the root, and regardless of what the truth is, that's what prevails, whether it aligns with what we want or not. Like that should be what takes precedence. And so for me, that's probably my favorite one, particularly from like an analytics perspective, because numbers don't lie. And so having confidence in understanding that the data can drive you and that we seek the truth through that data is something that for me really, really resonates. And I think as a company, Faire does this like unbelievably well. And because of that, I think it lets something like a B2B two-sided marketplace, which is like inherently incredibly complex, having this, I think, helps distill a lot of things and help us make the right decisions to grow the business faster.
Yeah. And is there anything that Faire does to strike that balance where, seek the truth isn't weaponized or isn't, used in a negative way?
Honestly, I haven't seen it be used in a negative way or weaponized at all. And I think part of the reason for that is the way that we go about hiring. And one of our core values is we are kind. I haven't seen very many other companies just like put that out there specifically. But I think doing that and like having that as part of your DNA helps mitigate the amount of times that, you might see a core value be weaponized. Right. Like I think to your point, like it could very easily be using seek the truth could be something that could be weaponized by, cutting the data certain ways or, trying to tell a different narrative. But with the other core value of, we are kind being there and the way that we hire, I think mitigates a lot of that.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit more about how Faire hires. I think for founders, like hiring is one of the biggest decisions you can make, right? How has Faire been able to sort of, it sounds like, nail that process, do a really great job of bringing in good talent? Like what's not the secret, but what's sort of the magic there?
That's a great question. I think, primarily for me, I would say, I think the thoughtfulness we put into actually sourcing and finding candidates, I think is one of them. We have a really strong referral program within Faire. And so I think because of that and the culture at Faire, we routinely see that people are, really proud to work at Faire. And so you're like more likely to refer your friends who are likely similar minded like you. And so, it helps build a really good culture through kind of that referral process. And then also I think our talent teams honestly do a really great job of filtering and sourcing the right folks. And so, we have, to me at least, I think a good balance of both technical and non-technical questions throughout our interview process, as well as like, I think it's, probably wouldn't call it a bar raiser, but we do have, a similar-ish concept where you have someone come in at the end to kind of ask and like kind of tally up things that we may not have got around or need a second look onto during the initial process. But I think we do a really good job of balancing both technical and non-technical there and using that feedback almost equivalently in our kind of review processes but the fact that you're a PhD that can code in 6 different languages doesn't necessarily trump the fact of how you would show up in the workplace. If we're asking, how do you manage your stakeholders? And if the answer is like, oh, I ignore them, I'm just going to do whatever's best. Like there's no amount of technical knowledge, I think, that's going to like offset that, right? And I think we're really conscious about that. And so from that perspective, I think we do a really good job of balancing both things.
And there can sometimes be a trap of hiring people that are culture fit versus culture add, right? How has Faire been able to continuously, I think it sounds like, make the culture better and better while still adhering to, hey, it's still the root culture, I guess?
Yeah, I think, the root culture really stemming from kind of being customer focused, data driven, and acting kindly, I think has such a strong foundation that when you find people that fit that, the bare minimum is that they're a culture fit. But more times than not, you're going to get a culture add, because I think we do a really good job of looking at folks who have different backgrounds, right? They may have worked in different sectors, or they may have like kind of unique perspectives to what, Faire does. I know there's a lot of folks at Faire who have family who are on the retailer side of the business, or who may even have their own brand or their own retail business. And so I think there's a lot of like unique perspective that's added on to the company that way through our hiring processes.
And I know this is not how you meant family, but I'm going to go down this route. I think a question often asked of women, and I'm trying to normalize it to everybody, but what is it? I mean, you're a parent of 2, right? Obviously, great relationship with your wife. Like, how are you able to maintain family life and professional life?
That's a great question. I'd say Faire is a phenomenal place for that because, obviously there are a lot of things to get done. It is, there are tough, problems to solve. But I think everybody here is very well aware of the fact that, when you have a family that you need to take care of them. And I think a lot of that has to do also, primarily with, who my bosses are, and have been, and that, they value that as well and understand the need to be able to balance that family and professional life. And so it's been great. Right. And I think what it really comes down to is, being able to have that flexibility to, work when needed and to be able to balance the family life when needed. With the understanding and the trust that, the things that need to get done are going to get done. Right. And so, I can give you a couple of examples where, our daycare is like randomly closed. Even last week, our daycare closed because the power went out at the daycare. Like the entire block from that building down into like the middle of the city in Fairfax was the whole thing was just out. No reason. So, I had to leave. I had to go get my older daughter and come back. And my manager, Paul, was more than understanding of this. And you're like, okay, you gotta do what you got to do. And that meant, obviously doesn't mean that I can just, push all my deadlines out, but it does mean that, I can take the time, take care of my daughter when needed. And then I can hop back on later that night and get things done that I need to. And so I think being able to have that balance and the trust and understanding that, you're an adult, you're going to get your things done is great. And I think Faire has done a particularly great job at that.
I mean, that's great to hear. And I think, many of us listening will probably think that cultures like Uber and Faire have to be always intense. And I think you and I have experienced that. That's not the case. One last sort of thing I wanted to bring up is you and I have had a very interesting team experiment where you and I co-led a team. And something that your boss, Dan Hockenmeyer, just posted about was org debt and how, org debt can be just as bad as tech debt. And so I think there's this interesting concept of how you can actually experiment with organizations and structure and things like that. Like you and I think were able to really thrive off this. And so maybe just a quick context on the co-leading for people listening. Our manager, Jin Yan, who we both have a really great relationship, was like, hey, you guys are both new to managing. Why don't you co-manage a team? And it was, I think, a small team of 3. But we were able to rely and feedback on each other and really managing for the first time, especially go from IC to manager, is really tough. And so it's kind of cool to have someone to be like, hey, how are you thinking about this? How are you doing this? Give me maybe if you have other examples of org experiments that you've seen and how that's actually that can be a big unlock to business impact when you get the org right.
That was such an interesting time. And I think I will say I had managed once before in my career, but the co-leading was, I think, the most unique example of that I could think of. And I can say pretty confidently, I think you kind of hit it on the nail. It's very rare that you have someone to just bounce ideas off of with the exact same group of people that you're managing, trying to figure things out. Obviously, it was a little rocky to start, but I think we got really good at it, honestly. And I think it worked really, really well and set both of our careers up for success. So thank you, Jin, for trusting in us and experimenting with us. And I'll say, with org structures and experimenting, I don't know how many other ones I can say that I've seen that are really true experiments. I think what tends to happen, is folks will try out a new structure and then not revert, I think is more often what I've seen. And I think that's where the two-way door scenario comes into play, which is that I think even with things like an org structure, assuming that you're not, completely rebuilding from the ground up when you're doing these things, most of the time can be a two-way door. And so if there's opportunities for you to think through and you think that there's a new structure, a new cadence of something that can help open up bandwidth, help open up ideas, help drive impact in some new way, I think just going back and thinking through okay, if we do this, how quickly would we need to revert if things went bad, and understand that you can do that, I think is a interesting mindset to kind of help tackle some of that work debt.
Again, this concept of a two-way door is something that I think many folks should hopefully dig into research and just really sort of take a step back and realize that many decisions are two-way doors. 3 more questions. What's been your favorite part of 2024? What are you looking forward to in 2025?
Oh, that's a great question. 2024, I would say my favorite part of 2024 is my youngest daughter was born in April. And so our family is now considerably more hectic, but it's worth every minute of it. So I think that's definitely my favorite part. And watching her grow, she's, if my wife listens to this and I get this wrong, this is going to come back to bite me in the ass. She's going to be 8 months this month.
Yeah.
And watching the relationship between her and our older daughter kind of grow over time has been amazing. It's weird. So I didn't have any siblings growing up. And, I think like that sibling bond thing is not something that I'm used to. But there's definitely, even at this age, I can see that there's like a very strong bond between the two of them. Like my older daughter can get the younger one to laugh, kind of like no matter what, and like laugh like uncontrollably. And like neither my wife nor I can replicate that no matter how much we try. And so like just seeing that bond there, I think has been really great. And I think what I'm looking forward to most in 2025 is, continuing to grow and expand my personal skill set within Faire and just as an analytics leader. And then I think also, continuing to grow and refine the skill set of being a parent of two, which I have found the playbook from being a parent of one does not translate super well to being a parent of two. And so I think trying to figure that out and get better at that, I think is something else I'm looking forward to in 2025.
And just again, last question, where can people find you if they want to reach out and learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah. I'm on LinkedIn. Feel free to search me that way. I don't have much of a other social presence for the most part, but I'm working on some things. So we'll see if there's anything else that we can tag on to here later. But primarily, if you need to reach out to me, I think LinkedIn is probably the best way.
Yeah, you should. You've got a lot of knowledge to share and a lot of cool stories. So I think you should start posting more.
Yeah.
But Gopal, it's been really great talking to you and reliving some of the great times we've had, but also just learning about you've worked now at two of the coolest marketplaces in the world, a lot of learnings. Really excited. Thank you for being a part of this. And we'll talk soon.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. It was great catching up.
Yeah. Thanks.
Take care.
Thanks for tuning into Experimental. If today's insights sparked new ideas or made you feel like a smarter marketer, consider leaving a review on your preferred podcast platform. It really helps support the show. For more in-depth discussions and resources, visit experimental.beehive.com. Until next time, be curious and stay experimental.